Hello, and welcome to Crusading History, discussing the latest research into the Crusades, crusading, and the Crusaded. In the early 13th century, the Mongol army stormed out of Central Asia and into the Middle East, creating a state there which would last for around a century. But why did the Mongols come? How did they interact with the Christian and the Muslim states they found in the region? And what were the long-term consequences of the Mongol invasions? With me to discuss these questions is Dr. Nick Morton, Associate Professor in the Department of Humanities at Nottingham Trent University and the author of the excellent book, The Mongol Storm. Okay, so Nick Morton, thank you very much for joining me today to talk about your excellent book on the Mongols. It's really great to have you here.
Well, thank you for having me on the show.
Excellent. So let's talk about the Mongols themselves. There's this great Mongol eruption out of Central Asia in the early 13th century. But who actually were the Mongols? Where did they come from? And why did they suddenly explode out of that region?
Okay, so the region of Mongolia in the 12th, 13th century, it's a very contested landscape. You have a whole selection of different communities and societies. Some of them are nomadic, some of them aren't, or some of them sort of blend elements of a nomadic and a more agricultural way of life. And the Mongols are among them. They're part nomadic. It seems as if they also have roots in the forest peoples of the coniferous forest belts to the north as well. And the Mongols, or Moals, by the time that Chinggis Khan has been born, they're not doing particularly well. They suffered a series of defeats. Chinggis Khan himself suffers a period of imprisonment. So this is a very inauspicious start in a sense. But Chinggis Khan, through a series of military expeditions and campaigns, he begins to weld together the various peoples of Mongolia. He doesn't win all the time. He suffers a major defeat in 1187. But the long-term narrative is one of him overcoming all opposition until he has brought together all the peoples of Mongolia. And then he begins to attack his periphery into northern China, later on into Central Asia as well. So this is the backstory to the advent of the Mongols, really.
Okay, and just to be clear, Chinggis Khan, this is the person who used to be known as Genghis Khan, and maybe to the listeners, maybe better known as that.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, so why then did he launch these great military campaigns after he had unified the Mongols?
This is a difficult question to answer because the official line, as it were, is that Chinggis Khan believed himself to have received a mandate from the eternal sky, from Tengri. And that mandate was to rule the entire human species, the planet. So he's after everything, and he feels he has a spiritual mandate to do that. Now, that's quite a sort of an easy answer to give. Where it becomes more complicated is that historians aren't quite sure whether that mandate was actually something in circulation at the time of Genghis Khan, or whether that idea emerged later under his heirs such as Ogadai or Guyuk. It's not entirely clear, but what's certainly clear is whatever ideas were going around in his head, he was very much intent on expanding as fast and as aggressively as possible.
Okay, so when he started these campaigns, they went in all directions. They went into China, they went down towards India. Eventually, they go into what's now Russia. And of course, one of the places they eventually ended up was the Near East, the Eastern Mediterranean, around the Crusader states. So what was the political situation of the Near East on the eve of the Mongol invasions?
So the Middle East this time is a complex landscape. There's lots of different protagonists across the area. You've got some quite small territories that would include for example, the Cilician kingdom of Armenia, which is just where the East Mediterranean coast curves into the southern coast of Anatolia. You've got the Crusader states along the coast of the East Mediterranean. But then you've got some big empires as well. And one of these would be the Ayyubid Empire. Now, that's the empire set up by Saladin, although it's now being ruled by his heirs. The name Ayyubid comes from Saladin's father, Ayyub. Then in central and eastern Anatolia, you have the Anatolian Seljuk Sultanate, which is one of the remaining territories from the great Seljuk invasions of the 11th century. And then further east, you've got a very large empire called the Khwarezmian Empire. And this too is an empire that is a successor state from the Seljuk Turkish Empire, which was set up in the 11th century. The Khwarezmians themselves were governors under the Seljuks, but now they rule much of what today would be Persia and sort of the steppe borders region as an empire of their own. So these are the major powers, but there are many smaller ones as well.
Okay, so when the Mongols attacked, they were extremely. I mean, in all directions, they were extremely successful. I mean, they conquered a vast area, the largest continuous land empire the world has ever seen. I mean, in that sense, why were they able to do so? Were those states vulnerable? And why were the Mongol armies so hard to stop for their opponents?
Yeah, so it's a historical phenomenon from, well, it's difficult to know when it started, but it carries on until at least the sort of 16th, 17th century. And that is the phenomenon in Eurasia, that every century or so, there is a major invasion by the various peoples of the Central Asian steppe region into their periphery. Now, we can talk about all sorts of examples of that phenomenon, whether it's the Huns invading into the Eastern Roman Empire, or whether it's the Chinese trying to keep the nomads out with the Great Walls of China and their various iterations, or previous peoples who have invaded into the Middle East, such as the Seljuk Turks, who I've already mentioned. And what makes these nomadic peoples particularly effective is not their numbers exactly. Often they're talked about nomadic hordes in the past. Well, that's not a particularly helpful way of describing them because they're not actually that numerous. What makes them powerful is that almost everyone in that society is raised to ride and shoot and hunt from a very early age. Now, these are all skills with military applications. But the Mongols go quite a long way beyond what steppe peoples have done previously. There have been other steppe empires, but the Mongols are bigger than any of them. And there are various reasons for that. One is the Mongols have an exceptional ability, a very brutal one, for forcibly enrolling conquered people into their own ranks. So if the Mongols conquer a civilization that they admire, who has a sort of a strong military ethos that they feel they can use, what they'll often do is to kill all the elite men of that culture and then forcibly enroll all the rank and file into their own ranks. So with every victory, they get bigger and stronger. They're also very effective learners. Famously, Genghis Khan, when he embarked on his invasions into northern China, he began to recruit, or at least to sort of forcibly enroll, Chinese siege engineers into his army and thereby address a traditional deficiency in his armies. And you can see this taking place as the Mongol Empire expands. They're learning new ideas and strategies. But that's only one side to it in a sense, because we'll put it this way. If you conquer one empire, then the next empire is going to be worried. If you've conquered 16, then your next empire you're going to be invading is going to be wondering whether this is worthwhile at all. And there is a momentum issue here, that once the Mongols begin to conquer, their own confidence, their own skills, their own military effectiveness increases, while the willingness to resist them seems in many cases to decrease among their next set of targets. And so there is a sort of compounding factor that victory does seem to lead to victory.
Okay, so then what, in concrete terms, made the Mongols' army different from their opponents? I mean, was it tactics, logistics, or, I mean, there's in the sources, there's a lot of talk about the kind of terror that they struck into the their opponents due to their massacring of basically everybody in the cities where they captured. And which of those do you think is the most important?
Yeah, the Mongols do. I mean, the Mongols do use terror tactics, although they're not the first to do that. There are other things they do which, again, are very effective, but not necessarily original or specific to the Mongols. Another one would be the way they organize their armies. So the Mongols organize their armies according to the decimal system, by which you have squadrons of 10, companies of 100, to use a modern word, battalions of 1,000, and then you have two-mans of 10,000. And just to go back to an earlier point, what makes them particularly effective is that when the Mongols conquer a civilization and enroll their warriors, they force them into this structure. And you might think, well, why would a warrior want to fight for the Mongols if they've just been conquered by them? But here's the point. That once you've been enrolled in a Mongol company of 10, if you should desert, then you'll do so knowing that the other 9 members of your company will be executed. And if your entire company deserts, then the 100, as it were, of the next size up, they will all be executed. So you've got to fight, whether you like it or not. So these all play out, albeit very brutally, in the Mongols' favor. But they're also very good at siege warfare. They seem to be very effective at getting into big cities. And early on, one of the ways they do this is when they do conduct their original invasions into the northern districts of the Khwarezmian Empire, around the line of the Siadaria or Oxus River. There are several big cities up there, places like Bukhara, Samarkand, places like that. And what they do is they conquer one city, and then they get together everyone from that city who's still alive anyway, and then they herd them to the next city and then drive them in advance of their own army. Now, the defenders in the next city will then set up their barrage of defensive catapults and archers shooting down anyone approaching their walls. But all they're really doing is shooting down all these people the Mongols have forced against their ramparts. And once they've exhausted their ammunition, then the Mongols attack with their real troops. So they do think of these various stratagems, albeit very brutal, which do make them that much more effective in combat.
Yes, as you say, very brutal tactics they're using in their invasions everywhere. So could you just very quickly run us through the route of the Mongols from Central Asia to the Near East?
Yeah, so it goes like this, that a Mongol caravan, I think it was in 1218, arrived in a border town of the Khwarezmian Empire, and it wanted to trade in various goods that it brought. And this isn't unusual. It's on what we would call today the Silk Road, so it's not at all unusual for caravans to turn up and start trading things. But for reasons that aren't quite clear, the town governor, called Inalchuk, arrested the Mongol caravan and then wrote to his master, Sultan Muhammad of the Khwarezmian Empire, telling him what he had done and asking for further instructions. And the instructions he received were that they should all be executed. So Inalchuk acted on the Sultan's advice and duly executed all the Mongol traders, but he didn't do the job properly because one escaped and got back to Genghis Khan, and well, you can guess what's going to happen next. The Mongols arrived outside the city, sacked the city, and then executed Inalchuk by pouring molten metal down his throat. This is really the first step in the Mongols' invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire, and soon after that they begin to attack the major border cities of the empire, while a flying column tries to hunt down the Khwarezmian Sultan, Sultan Muhammad, and they don't find him. But in the process, they go south of the Caspian Sea, then up through the Caucasus, and that really is a major alarm bell for all the other civilizations in the area that the Mongols are a very real threat. After that, there's a sort of hiatus for about 9 years. And in those 9 years, the various major territories in the Middle East, the Ayyubids, the Anatolian Seljuks, what's left of the Khwarezmians, they're all busy fighting amongst themselves. And there's a really big battle in 1230. And then a few months after that big battle, the Mongols' next major invasion army comes in. And so the infighting in the Middle East really does make it easier for the Mongols to conquer much of the region. And so by the time we get to the 1230s, the Mongols have conquered pretty much all of Persia, modern-day Iran, much of eastern Iraq, much of the Caucasus, and then in 1243 they invade the Anatolian Seljuk Sultanate and win a major battle at Kozhedeg, which forces the Anatolian Seljuk Sultanate into submission. After that, there's another hiatus, this time for about 15 years, and then a new great Khan called Monka, he sends his brother Hulagu with a huge invasion army into the Middle East. He then suppresses the assassins in what's left of the independent parts of Persia. And then, as is well known, there's then in 1258 the siege and then a horrific sack of Baghdad by the Mongol armies. After that, Hulagu's force goes to northern Syria, where it takes the major city of Aleppo, following which the northern Crusader state of Antioch submits to Mongol authority. And that brings us to about 1260, really. And by that point, the greater part of the Middle East, by far the greater part of the Middle East, is now either under Mongol direct control or that comprises of states that have officially submitted to Mongol overlordship. Another example, for example, would be the Empire of Trebizond in northern Anatolia, or Cilician Armenia. There's really only two territories, arguably three territories left that are still fully independent. That's the tiny county of Tripoli, the smallest of the Crusader states. There's the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which is very much reduced at this point compared to the 12th century. And then there's the Mamluk Empire in Egypt. So a little bit of background on the Mamluks. The Mamluk Empire came about in 1250, when the Mamluks, or the enslaved soldiers recruited and fielded by the Ayyubid Empire, rose up, rebelled against the Ayyubids and took power for themselves. So 1260 really is the high tide mark of the Mongol invasions into the area.
Okay, so once they had created this vast empire and, as you say, conquered all these lands around the Middle East, they then attacked Egypt. So can you tell us a little bit about what happened after that?
Yes. So as we've got so far to 1260, and as you can see, the Mongols at that point, they're looking pretty unstoppable. And they send envoys down to Egypt. And the envoys are carrying the Mongols' customary message, which is very, very, very simple. Mongol diplomacy at this point, at least, is fairly straightforward, in most cases at least. You've got two choices. You can submit to Mongol authority, in which case you will become a client state to the Mongols. And the earlier you do that, the more lenient the Mongols will be. Or you can defy the Mongol envoys, in which case you should expect invasion. Now, the Mamluks send a very, very clear message, because of the three Mongol envoys, if memory serves me, the Mamluks kill two of them and shave the beard of the third, which of course is a gross insult. So what they're essentially saying is, we're going to fight. There's no alternative now. After acting like that, the Mongols are going to invade whatever happens next. And I suspect the Mamluks were so aggressive in their diplomacy because clearly the decision had been taken that they would fight the Mongols, but also by acting in that way, it shuts down any other argument. You can't say, well, actually, let's have another thought, think about this. No, they've executed the Mongol envoys. They are going to fight now. And so the Mamluks march out with their army out from Egypt. And that's an important point. Everyone the Mongols ever fought previously has waited to be attacked. The Mamluks don't. They march out beyond their own borders and seek battle with the Mongols. And they have an army of around maybe 12,000 troops, which is pretty much all they can put together. Now, this is an astonishingly gutsy move, because the Mongol field army invading into the Middle East is thought to have been a minimum of 100,000 strong. So the Mamluks are taking on remarkable odds. And you can see a sort of measure of this when the Mamluks go past the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and the Mamluks, or Sultan Qutuz, says to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, "Do you want to join forces with us and we'll fight the Mongols together?" And the Kingdom of Jerusalem is clearly sort of very concerned about how these things are unfolding. And so they hold a council, and the outcome seems to be that they will give the they'll give the Mamluks food and provisions. They'll also sell them horses, but they're not going to fight alongside them. I suspect part of their reasoning, at least, would have been that they're just not going to win, so why would they? But they also want to hedge their bets, just for the off chance the Mamluks win. They want to be able to say, well, we've offered you a bit of support there. But things go really well for the Mamluks, because for reasons the Mamluks couldn't have foreseen, the great Khan in Mongolia, Monka, dies, and news arrives at the Mongol encampment in Syria. And so Hulagu, hearing of his brother's death, withdraws eastwards with the bulk of his troops, leaving a garrison of around 20,000 in Syria. So in fact, what the Mamluks encounter is not the Mongols' main field army, it's this garrison. And they defeat it in a battle called Ainjal. It was a crucial battle in 1260, and then force the Mongols out of Syria, after which the Mamluks then take Damascus and Aleppo very quickly. And so suddenly, having previously been solely based in Egypt, within the space of a few months, they now have much of Syria under their control as well, vastly increasing their empire and actually creating a very similar territorial footprint to Saladin in the 12th century. There is, of course, the big catch. The Mongols will be coming back as soon as they possibly can.
Okay, thank you. So, one of your book's most striking themes that as the Mongols go through the Middle East, many groups, many kingdoms, states chose to submit to the Mongols or collaborate with them. So, why was that?
Okay, so there are several examples of this happening. Quite an interesting one is Cilician Armenia, which I mentioned. It's just to the north of the Principality of Antioch, where the Eastern Mediterranean coast curves into southern Anatolia. Now, the Armenians have quite a sort of a well-defended kingdom in that area, protected by the Amanus and Taurus mountains. But then they're a small power. They have to negotiate a path to their own survival amidst much more powerful empires around their periphery. Now, when the Mongols invade Anatolia and force the Anatolian Seljuks into submission, the Armenians seem to have realized that no one's going to be stopping the Mongols. So they've got a choice. Now, at this point, the Mongols are still some way off. So what they could do is they could wait to be invaded. And if that happens, well, quite honestly, if the Anatolian Seljuks can't keep the Mongols out, the chances of them doing so as a much smaller power are very limited. So offering resistance doesn't look particularly appetizing as a choice. So instead, they decide to submit. Now, submitting to the Mongols, particularly submitting early, it offers quite a lot. Because if the Mongols have to force you to submit, then the conditions are going to be fairly harsh. They're going to impose a large annual tribute. They'll probably want to keep a substantial garrison on your lands. You're really going to feel it. But if you submit early, and even better, if you can sort of play the line that you're doing this almost quasi-voluntarily, well, the Mongols appreciate this because they want to encourage everyone to do that. I mean, they may be an incredibly powerful military empire, but what conqueror wouldn't want people just to voluntarily submit to them? And so the Armenians are able to negotiate a very advantageous situation for themselves. They don't initially have a Mongol garrison. Their tribute is light and they're left alone. And so nominally submitting to the Mongols is actually a very effective way of maintaining their own security and stability. In fact, later on, when the Mamluk Empire comes under repeated attack, they're able to actually draw on that relationship and say, well, look, you are our overlord. You need to be helping us to protect ourselves. Well, in fact, that doesn't work very well, but the mere fact they can sort of pull on that thread shows that this relationship can be made to work for them too. So submission can be something that can work, not just for the conqueror, but for the submitted as well. But there are compromises. And this creates all sorts of difficulties. And so when, for example, one Armenian elite goes to the Mongols as an envoy to conduct the next round in talks about how their relationship's going to work, the Mongols are very pleased with him. And so as a reward, to show their appreciation, they give him the enormous honor of a Mongol bride. What an incredible gesture to make. Problem is, he's already married. And of course, this is Armenia, so it's a Christian civilization. You only get to have one wife. So what does he do? Now, we're not quite told how this played out, but it would have been diplomatic suicide to do anything other than to accept that bride. But of course, that in itself brings a compromise. So there are all sorts of these compromises being made by various different states as they try and negotiate a path to their own security.
So the Mongols themselves are often described as being religiously tolerant, as you kind of mentioned the Armenian Christians there. How true is that, and what does tolerance mean in these circumstances?
Yeah, the Mongols are. This is something that's sort of very well known, I think, and people do remark on it at the time. They note the Mongols don't necessarily differentiate, at least in their early years, between the various peoples that they've conquered. But this is tolerance of a particular kind. This is dictated by their own thinking, by their own worldview. It's not necessarily an exact copy of what we might think of as tolerance today. And I think perhaps one of the helpful ways to think about it is there's a missionary, a Franciscan traveller, who goes to the Mongol Empire, and he's quite a lively observer. He picks up a lot. And within his travels, he goes to Karakorum, which is the Mongol capital. And during his time there, he's involved in a religious debate that the Mongols organize between the various religions under their control. And so he participates in this debate. And afterwards, he's talking to the Mongol Great Khan. The Mongol Great Khan holds up his hand and says, the religions of the world are like the fingers on a hand. And I think what's being said there is that, they are that from that worldview, they're all connected. Now, he doesn't say this, but I've got a feeling that what he means by that is that they're all connected, but the Mongols are the palm. That they are all expressions of spirituality, of spiritual power, but it's the Mongol worldview that connects them. That's always been my strong suspicion with that. And certainly the Mongols do see the religious leaders of the various people they've conquered as people with spiritual power, but they want them to use that power for the benefit of the Mongol Empire. So if you're a religious leader of whatever religion it might be, you are expected to pray, use your spiritual power or whatever you've got for the betterment of the Mongol Empire. So you become an asset in that sense. So a little bit like the way the Mongols might spare goldsmiths or metalsmiths or miners or people who can actually do things to profit them. Religious leaders are viewed in the same way. So yes, it's tolerance of a sort. You can practice your faith. The Mongols are prepared to accept that your faith has spiritual power, but it is spiritual power under Mongol hegemony. It is spiritual power to be expressed for the betterment of the Mongol Empire.
Okay, so in that sense, then, how did the Christian and the Muslims and the various other religious communities that the Mongols conquered, how did they view the Mongols themselves, the conquests, particularly kind of theologically speaking?
Yeah, so a very common theme, which you find in surviving works from many different cultures, is the notion that the Mongols are a divine punishment, that they have sinned themselves, and therefore the Mongols have invaded and caused harm to their lands as an expression of divine dissatisfaction with their behavior. Now that sounds like an incredibly sort of harsh interpretation of the Mongol invasion. It's quite a hard idea, but there is a glimmer of hope in there too, because what's basically being said is if they can address that behavior, if they can improve, maybe that time of suffering will pass. But there's another side to this as well. I often at this point invoke Hollywood, because Hollywood loves creating films where, I don't know, an enemy invades with a huge invasion army. No one can stop it. And then eventually some young people, generally often fairly good looking, say, enough, we have suffered enough. We must drive these people away. And then there's a montage as they get trained and they share some jokes and they go and help some people to show to prove that they're the good guys. Big battle at the end, happiness and victory reigns supreme. It just doesn't work like that. The Mongols are unstoppable, particularly in their early years, and anyone who tries military rebellion against the Mongols just gets crushed. So that notion that, once you've had enough, once the people are suffering, that you can rise off and throw off the conquerors, that's just not a thing at this point. The Mongols are just too powerful. So what you get is a very different phenomenon, where it's almost exactly the opposite. You get emissaries, missionaries, politicians, sometimes merchants, going to the Mongol wagon cities, one of the great sites of the Mongol Empire, these massive thousands of wagons, millions of animals that are the center points of their empire. And these agents are going to the Mongol encampment and they're doing the exact opposite. They're telling the Mongols are wonderful. The Mongols are an expression of divine will. And they try and make themselves useful to the Mongols. They offer to administer the Mongols' lands, raise and educate their children, to help in central government, to conduct trade, whatever it takes to make themselves useful. This is almost the exact opposite of armed rebellion. And they're doing it for a specific reason, or at least some of them are doing it for a very specific reason. Because once you've made yourself useful, once you've ingratiated yourself, then you can start to ask for favors. Well, our society, they're really nice and they like you. Why don't you give them a bit of tax relief? Or our society, we're being given a difficult, we've got some enemies ourselves. There are other people also within your empire who are being really, really unkind to us. Perhaps you could attack them. Or the all-time number one, maybe you should convert to our religion. It would help you to rule over our people. And what I'm describing here is the process of conquering the conquered, or conquering the conquerors, I should say. And so this process of ingratiation, trying to win the Mongols' support, try and win their goodwill, you can see people from across Eurasia trying to do this, because military resistance, like I said, at least not in the early years, that's not working. So it's a very different kind of response.
Okay. So you mentioned a couple of people who were sent to the Mongol court, John of Plano Carpini and the Armenians. Latin Europe sent quite a few people there, or quite a few Latin Europeans went there voluntarily. Can you just tell us a little bit about who they were?
Yes, so a lot of people go out to the Mongols. Many of them are actually sent there by the papacy. So particularly, I think it's in 1245, papacy sends out groups of envoys along different geographical vectors to try and encounter the Mongols, to conduct diplomacy with them. But of course, like so many people from across Eurasia, the key questions here are, who are these people? They don't actually know. What do they want? How can they be stopped? What's their culture like? What can we find out about them? What do they believe in? And so these emissaries go out and they conduct diplomacy. There are other people who go out to them too. Another classic one would be Marco Polo, for example. Well, he's going for trade. And so there's all sorts of reasons why people from Western Christendom, but also people from other parts of the world, are going out to the Mongols to conduct diplomacy, but also for trade or just for the sheer adventure of it. And certainly it does become a situation where the various trade routes of Eurasia, they begin to centralize on the Mongols' big wagon cities, because the Mongols have massive disposable wealth. And so trade can be another reason why Western Europe and other regions sends out merchants, or merchants go of their own volition, to the Mongol camps. Now, can I ask you, Alex,
Yes.
Would you like a story about owls?
I would love a story about owls.
Of course you would. Right. So there is a story that was given or reported by someone called Richard of Montecroce, who's a friar who travelled a great deal in the Middle East region. He tells this story. And according to his story, when the Mongols, many years before the Mongols had conquered so much of Eurasia, they were penned in a very tight space by a dense mountain range that prevented them from going anywhere outside their homeland. And there's only one pass through that mountain range. Now, of course, they could use that pass, but there is a deserted fortress in that pass, and that fortress is thought to be the home of many evil spirits, so they can't go that way. But then one day, a warrior is out hunting a hare on horseback with his dogs, and he's so intent on the chase that the dogs chase the hare into this fortress, and the warrior goes straight in after them. And only later, to his horror, does he realize exactly where he is. And so he looks about him, and then suddenly there is a loud cry. He thinks, oh my goodness, this is the evil spirits. But then he sees it's not actually evil spirits, it's an owl. And so due to this, he knows that the terrible cries that everyone thought were owls, so everyone thought were evil spirits, were in fact owls. And so the owl becomes seen as a spiritual messenger guiding the Mongols on their conquest. And certainly we have reports in other sources of Mongols wearing owl feathers in their hats. Now, I am going somewhere with this, I promise. The point Richard makes in his account is that because the owls are seen as a spiritual messenger guiding the Mongols on their conquests, that creates a situation where you have a seller's market for owl feathers, because all the Mongol warriors want owl feathers. So merchants from everywhere begin to descend upon the Mongol encampments with owl feathers to sell, to such an extent that there are Richard reports culls of owls. So people go and find whatever owls they can, because this is what the Mongols are willing to buy. And the point he's making really is the Mongols, having conquered dozens of different civilizations and turned all their wealth and gold and treasure into spendable coin, they have enormous purchasing power. And so if the Mongols want owl feathers is what they will get. And he finishes this little rather sad story by pointing out that the Mongols return bad to good for their friend the owl, who had led them on their conquest but now is hunted down and killed. But I think the point I'm making here is the magnetic attraction of the Mongol court, given the sheer quantity of cash they're willing to spend for those who bring the things they want.
Okay. So you've touched a little bit on trade there, and obviously they created this vast empire. How did that empire, the creation of that empire, reshape the trade routes all across Eurasia?
Yeah, so the Mongols have an enormous ability to draw merchants to them, and there's been some great work done on this subject by all sorts of people. One particularly that sticks out of my mind, which is a study on the Mongols and the pearl trade. Well, the Mongols don't control regions, or many regions, that produce pearls. Naturally, you need to have access to a warm ocean for that. But because they have this incredible spending power, it draws merchants from across Eurasia well beyond their own frontiers, bringing merchants to them because they have this wealth. But then there's also the fear of Mongol invasions and its effect on trade routes. So having talked about owls, I'm now going to talk about herring. And it's not a Monty Python quote, don't worry. So there's a town in the Kingdom of England called Great Yarmouth. I think it's in around 1240. The people of Great Yarmouth, they bring in an enormous catch of herring. Celebration. They're going to be able to sell that herring, and then presumably they can buy the things they need, new tools, new clothes, whatever it is they want. And they're accustomed to selling that herring to merchants from the Baltic Sea region, particularly from northern Germany, that sort of area, or the Isle of Gotland. But the merchants don't turn up. And the reason they don't turn up, we're told, is because there's such a great fear in this period of an imminent Mongol invasion into Eastern Europe, the merchants just don't feel able to leave their homes. And so one of the unexpected side effects of the Mongol invasions is that the people of Great Yarmouth were left with a huge pile of decomposing fish. So there we are.
I mean, that's a really, really interesting point. So what's happening, in 1220 in Mongolia is then 20 years later affecting the people in Great Yarmouth. So then, I mean, did the Mongols in that sense create some kind of globalization with this empire they created?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the most astonishing side effects of the Mongol invasions that the people of Eurasia and to some extent Africa, their horizons are significantly expanded as a result of these invasions. And just to give an example I particularly find interesting on this is, I've mentioned the Mamluks already. And the Mamluks have an empire centered in Egypt, which then acquires territories in Syria. Well, they conduct diplomacy with the Mongols. And one particular branch of the Mongol Empire called the Golden Horde, which today would encompass much of Russia and Ukraine and Eastern Europe and areas like that. The Mamluks sent diplomats to the Golden Horde in the Crimea. And again, the Mamluk diplomats find this massive Mongol wagon city, which takes several days for them to cross. And then they get to the Golden Horde's leaders. And the Golden Horde want to know who they are. And so the Mamluks say, oh, well, we're the Mamluk Empire, we're from Egypt. And the Mongols have heard of Egypt. And they say, Egypt, isn't that the place with an enormous bone that crosses a massive river? And the Mamluks say, well, yes, there is a big river in Egypt. It's called the Nile. And the Mongols say, yes, you've got a big bone bridge, don't you, that crosses the Nile. And the Mamluks are very tactful at this point. They just say they haven't seen the bridge. But what we're looking at here is a phenomenon that you find from all sorts of different cultures across the whole Eurasian continent and indeed Egypt as well, but also in the Mongols themselves, which is that they are testing the hearsay and rumor that they have heard previously against the experience of actually meeting people from these areas. And you see this in so many different contexts. You have Western European emissaries, again, going back to the Friar William of Rubruck I mentioned earlier. Now, he's done his homework before he goes on a diplomatic mission to the Mongols. He's read various classical authors to see what he can expect to find in Central Asia. And these classical authors tell him that he will find monsters. He gets there, no monsters. Although, interestingly enough, the people he meets tell him stories about monsters from their own sort of folklore and legends, but he doesn't see them. And so here, too, is an example where he has looked back at the traditions of his people, Western Christendom in this case, and then tested them against the reality in Central Asia. And so this process of horizons expanding and all sorts of things being shared, whether that's stories or ideas or religions or technologies or trade goods, that's happening at an incredible pace throughout this period.
So we left the Mongols in their story, in their invasion at Ayyubid just after they were defeated there in 1260. That was, I think, the first time they'd really been defeated properly in battle. So why, having been almost invincible up to that point, did they not stay that way afterwards?
Okay, so the Mongol Empire from 1260 begins to go into experience a series of major problems that are in fact discernible in earlier decades. Basically, the Mongol Empire is vast and very hard to govern, particularly using the technologies available. Now, the Mongols can do some things about this. So they have, for example, what's called a fast horse system, which means you have relays of horses at way stations at regular intervals on major roads, so messages can travel very quickly. That's one way of managing the distances involved, but even that, it's going to take a long time for messages to get to Karakorum and back again. And so whole sectors of the Mongol Empire are handed out to leading members of the imperial Mongol family as ulu. And ulu are basically areas of jurisdiction, areas under their jurisdiction. But the problem is that, as with so many sort of families which have ambitious and aggressive children who want to create empires for themselves, the question of exactly where an ulu begins and ends and who has jurisdiction over which bits, that becomes very heavily contested. Now, I mentioned Hulagu, who conquered much of the Middle East. Well, he claims the Middle East as his ulu, as part of his ulu. But to the north of the Middle East, in what today would be, I suppose, Western Russia, you have, as I've mentioned, another branch of the Mongol Empire, descended from Genghis Khan's son Jochi, called what have become known as the Golden Horde. And they think that they have jurisdiction over the Middle East. And the tensions between these two, between Hulagu in the Middle East and the Golden Horde in the north, they begin to really sort of escalate at exactly this time. And so news of Ayyubid arrives. Hulagu swears revenge. This will not be left unavenged for any amount of time. He will attack the Mamluks immediately. At the same time, the Golden Horde to the north is preparing its forces for the full-scale invasion of Western Christendom. And no one's expecting anyone to be able to stop them. You've got various emissaries going back to the papacy, basically saying, yeah, there's not much we can do about this. The Mongols are just so incredibly powerful. So the Mongols are ready to expand dramatically on two fronts. One against the Mamluk Empire in the Middle East, and the other against Western Christendom in the north. But instead, they turn against each other. And so the line of the Caucasus Mountains becomes a frontier of war between these two branches of the Mongol imperial family, and they fight war after war after war against each other. And that process essentially blunts their invasion and gives time in the Middle East for the Mamluks to fortify the line of the Euphrates River, military roads, fortresses along the major fords, building up their economy so they can raise a larger army, all sorts of methods and methodologies to try and make sure that they can hold off the next Mongol invasion. And in fact, while they're waiting, they take apart what's left of the Crusader states, not in some sort of epic duel of mighty powers. The Crusader states are tiny compared to the Mamluks by this stage. Castle by castle, city by city, the Crusader states are taken apart by the Mamluks, seemingly almost as training exercises, while they're waiting for their real opponents, who are the Mongols, to launch their next major invasion. But it doesn't happen for 21 years, which gives the Mamluks time to consolidate themselves.
So from what you've just said, what kind of time period are we talking about for the destruction of the Crusader states?
Okay, so Ayyubid in 1260. After that, the Mamluks fortify the Euphrates River and make sure they've laid in preparations against the Mongols. But they've got a 21-year period, of course they don't know it yet, until the Mongols return, because the Mongols are too busy caught up in their internal fighting. And in that period, the Mamluks take apart nearly all the inland areas of the Crusader states. And one key moment would be when they conquer Antioch in 1268, which is the end of the Principality of Antioch. There are a few cities left by the time the Mongols invade again in 1281. But when the Mongols do invade, and they're thought to have had an army of maybe around 60,000 troops, and I mean, one historian suggests that the Mongol battlefront may have been 26 kilometers wide. So this really is war making on a continental scale. But the Mamluks still win. They win that battle. And it takes another 18 years for the Mongols to come back again. And in that 18 years, the Mamluks take apart the last vestiges of the mainland Crusader states, with the major date being the overthrow of the city of Acre, the capital of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, in 1291. And after that, the only major Crusader state left is the Kingdom of Cyprus off the coast. Cilician Armenia survives for a while, although Armenia also collapses in 1375 due to Mamluk invasions, although that's some way in the future.
So then how does the Mongol Empire not exactly collapse, but how does it kind of become part of the fabric of the Middle East after 1281?
Yeah, so the Mongol Empire is already breaking up. For a long time, it maintains the idea or the argument that it's part of a greater whole. And of course, there is a natural kinship between the various branches of the Mongol Empire. But there's also tensions and rivalries as well. The Mongols in China adopt many aspects of Chinese culture, and in the Middle East, many aspects of Persian culture are adopted by the Mongols in what becomes known as the Ilkhanate. But in time, the Mongols also, it's not quite clear, there's a lot of debate about exactly how this happens and why this happens. In the Middle East, the Mongols also convert steadily to Islam, with a major turning point taking place in the 1290s with the conversion of Sultan Ghazan. Now, for a long time, the Mongols hold their original shamanistic beliefs alongside their emerging Islamic beliefs. But in the long term, they do convert to Islam, which again helps them to build a stronger rapport, at least with the Muslim communities of the Middle East. And that sort of embeds their rule to an extent. But by the time we get to the 14th century, the Mongols in the Middle East, their empire begins to break up. There's various dynastic disputes. Individual governors for particular regions go independent. And it has to be said, there's also quite a strong kinship to the Mongols who have just invaded and the various Turkish societies that invaded about 200 years before this, with the Seljuk Turks. And notably, when one writer describes the difference between the Mongols and the Turks, he says, well, the Mongols do up their robes on one side and the Turks do it on the other side. And if that's the scale of the difference, yeah, then it shows us how closely aligned they are. So there is a natural, there are various communities in the Middle East that would naturally see an affinity with the Mongols and will aid that process. And then pile on into that the fact that you've got all sorts of trade taking place, sharing of ideas and foods, and that will ultimately cause the Mongols to sort of situate themselves more thoroughly in the Middle East until at least you get to the next wave of Mongol invasions under the Emir Timur, but that's perhaps another story.
Yes, yeah. So the Mongols then they're only around for around 100 years, but obviously they have this huge impact on not just the Middle East, but all over Eurasia. So which of the changes that the Mongols unleashed do you think lasted the longest, or it was the most impactful?
Yeah, there's a lot of changes, and I think it's only fair to flag up just the sheer devastation caused by their invasions over such a wide area first. But so many different societies were overthrown by the Mongols. You've got the assassins or Nizaris in Persia. You have the conquest of Baghdad, which also involves the murder of the Abbasid Caliphate, so a crucial moment in the history of Sunni Islam. You have the overthrow of the Ayyubid Empire, that's Saladin's empire. The Anatolian Seljuks are forced into submission and then ultimately crushed by the Mongols. This is also the period of the end of the Crusader states, although the Mongols weren't the ones to end them. They still put events in motion that helped to were part of that process. So many different societies are overthrown in this era. But there's another factor here too, which is that the Mongols set a lot of peoples in motion. There's a sort of bow wave of people trying to get out of the way. And of course they want to get out of the way because the Mongols are incredibly dangerous. So thousands and thousands of families moving west to try and get out of the way of the Mongols. Now, in the sort of Central Eurasian regions, sort of what would be modern day Russia, Ukraine, that sort of area, you've got tens of thousands of people moving west to get out of the way of the Mongols, but lots of these people are captured by the Mongols and then sold to traders in the Crimea, who then take them down to Egypt and then sell them as enslaved people to the Ayyubids, later on to the Mamluks. And so they're selling them to be raised as Mamluk warriors. Now, and it's thought that the expansion of the Mamluk regiments under the Ayyubids, because they can purchase enslaved people so easily, that may go some way to explaining why the Mamluks were able to ultimately to rise up, overthrow the Ayyubids, and take power for themselves. So within the chain of events leading to the rise of the Mamluk Empire, perhaps we can see the Mongols' own actions. And another example of this would be, again, peoples moving westwards into Anatolia. And among them are tens of thousands of Turkish families, nomadic peoples. And they move westwards into Anatolia in large numbers until they've got such numbers that they begin to form sort of micro-states in central and western Anatolia called beyliks. Now, those beyliks become very powerful over time, such as a beylik of Karaman, for example, or to give another example, the Ottoman beylik. And it's thought that the Ottomans were initially a people driven westwards by the Mongols, but of course, in time, they will go on to found an empire that will overthrow the Byzantine Empire and survive into the 20th century. Now, the Mongols didn't intentionally do any of these things, but as is so often the case with major epoch-changing events, often the unintended consequences can be the more important ones. And certainly the rise of the Mamluk and Ottoman Empire, deep within the warp and weft of events, you can see the influence of the Mongol Empire.
Yes, and certainly they were longer lasting and indeed probably deeper changes by the Mamluks and the Ottomans than by the Mongols. So just to wrap up then, if we stop then seeing the Mongols as a external catastrophe and instead part of Near Eastern history, how does that change how we think about or understand the medieval world?
Yeah, I mean, it has been the Mongols in many ways were a catastrophe to many people, but yes, their involvement in the Middle East isn't well known, but I think that they also serve as a reminder for anyone studying the Middle East in many periods that the Middle East exists at the fulcrum of Eurasia and Africa. The Middle East is, by definition, an area that is at the center of events that can begin way beyond however you define the borders of the Middle East. External powers will influence events there. And I've already mentioned various other peoples who came to the Middle East with armies of conquest. The Seljuk Turks would be one example. The Crusaders would be another. So in many ways, the history of the Middle East is shaped to a degree, at least, by the various external peoples who invaded and conquered it. And you can see that going back throughout history and pick up other examples too, I'm sure. But I think for me, and this is a large chunk of the reason why I find the Middle East so fascinating. And that is just the sheer amount of exchange that's taking place in the marketplaces, in the palaces, on the roads, in domestic houses. So much is being exchanged. News of faraway places, strange trees, plants, animals, stories. The Mongols for a time brought Buddhism into the Middle East. It didn't last for very long, but there too it's an example of this enormous of exchange taking place in the Middle East. We have cookbooks from the era which have recipes from cultures that come from very far afield. And so for me, at least, what I find so fascinating about the Mongols and their impact, or one of the aspects of their impact in the Middle East, is their influence on the shaping of events, but also the shaping of culture as well. You can see it in technology. The Mongols tried to implement paper money in Tabriz. Well, this is a Chinese idea the Mongols have picked up and are now trying to apply. Enormously unsuccessful, because I mean, why on earth would people want to hand over their hard-earned gold and silver coins to bits of paper? It makes no sense. But it's interesting that they're trying. In a similar vein, it's thought, just to take a military example, it's thought that the concept of the trebuchet came originally from China. And in its earliest iteration, it was involved people pulling down on ropes. to hurl up the throwing arm. Well, it seems to have, the current narrative is that it came from China to the Middle East, Middle East to the Mediterranean, Mediterranean to other regions such as Western Europe. But then during the Crusades, there's been some great work done by Mike Fulton on this. The idea has been advanced that in the wars of that era, the trebuchet powered by people pulling on ropes was replaced by a counterweight trebuchet, which involved a huge, great block of counterweight pulling the throwing arm down and hurling up the projectile. Well, what's interesting is that the Mongols learn about counterweight trebuchets in the Middle East, and the Mongol armies in China ask for engineers to be sent to them who can share that technology. And so the technology comes full circle as a result of the Mongols' invasion. So there's so many things like that. People, ideas, concept, technologies, knowledge, shaping the way that the Middle East evolves, but also shaping all neighboring regions as well.
Yes. And I think, yeah, your book really does a great job demonstrating just the Eurasian-wide impact of the Mongol invasion. Anyway, Nick, thank you very much for joining me today to talk about this, your excellent book. I look forward very much to the prequel, which you have mentioned you're writing at the moment. But yes, thank you once again.
Thank you.
And my thanks again to Dr. Nick Morton for guiding us through his excellent book on the Mongols. If you've enjoyed what he's been saying and want to learn more, I've put a link to the book in the description box below so you can buy it from the publisher. If you've appreciated this video and you like this channel, please do consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. I'll be back in a couple of weeks with a new video. Please do join me then if you can.